What happens to our faith when life's challenges seem bigger than the promises we've trusted in? Life often brings us to moments we never imagined, where faith is all we have to keep moving forward. This is the story of the Johnson family. The Johnson family had always been held together by faith, even when life threw its harshest trials their way. In the quiet stillness of their modest home, there was an unspoken understanding between them. A sense that even though they were on the edge of losing everything, they still had each other. That and their unwavering trust in God. "Baby, have you seen my tie, the blue one?" Marcus's voice came from the other room, calm and steady as always, though there was an undercurrent of strain that hadn't been there before. He entered the kitchen, a man who had given his best to a world that didn't seem to give much back in return. He loved his job teaching history at the high school, but lately, the bills had been piling up, and even his love for the work couldn't soften the edges of financial reality. Their daughter Destiny rushed in, full of youthful energy and hope, but even she was starting to sense the tension that lingered in their home. "Mom, I need $30 for the field trip today," she asked innocently. A simple request, but in that moment, it felt like a mountain they couldn't climb. Marcus and Michelle exchanged a look. No words were needed. They both knew the answer before it was spoken. "We might have to skip this one," Marcus said softly. The look of disappointment in Destiny's eyes was like a knife to Michelle's heart. How long could they keep doing this? How long could they hold on, trusting that somehow everything would work out? She wished she could give her daughter more, wished that the love and faith they had was enough to shield them from the harshness of the world. But it wasn't. Later that day, Michelle found herself sitting alone in the church, the weight of everything finally catching up to her. The quiet hum of the sanctuary did little to calm her restless thoughts. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered a prayer that had become all too familiar. "Lord, I'm trying not to be anxious, but how? How do I keep the peace when everything's falling apart?" At home, Marcus sat in the living room, staring at a letter from the bank. They were months behind on their mortgage. The weight of the letter pressed heavily on him, and for the first time, he felt truly powerless. "We've always made it work before. Always," he said aloud, as if trying to convince himself that this time wouldn't be any different. But it was different. He could see it in Michelle's tired eyes, hear it in the unspoken fears that hung in the air. "What if this time we can't?" Michelle voiced what they both feared but had been too afraid to say. Their son Anthony watched from the hallway, unseen. His young mind tried to make sense of the tension he didn't fully understand, but it scared him. And like any child afraid of the unknown, he started to act out at school, his way of coping with the fear that his family might be falling apart. In the classroom, Marcus continued to teach with the same passion that had always driven him. He spoke to his students about history, about the civil rights movement, about hope in the face of adversity. But even here, reality intruded. "Mr. Johnson," a student asked one day, "why do you still teach here? My mom says you could make more money at the private school across town." The question caught Marcus off guard, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. But then, as he looked out at the faces of the students who needed him, he knew the answer. Because sometimes, the richest things in life aren't about money, he said quietly, but firmly. Meanwhile, Michelle worked long hours at the hospital, tending to patients while carrying the weight of her own worries. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly patient she had grown close to, noticed the weariness in her. "Child, you've got that look again," she said gently. "The one that says you're carrying the world on your shoulders." Michelle smiled weakly, not wanting to burden the older woman with her troubles. "Just trying to keep faith, Mrs. Jenkins." "That's exactly when you need to let it go," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice soft but wise. "All that worry? It's like carrying an umbrella inside. You don't need it." The words lingered with Michelle as she returned home that night. The house was dark, the electricity shut off. Candles flickered, casting a warm glow over the faces of her family as they sat around the dinner table. Despite everything, they still held on to each other and to their faith. The Johnson family sat together in the dim light of flickering candles, their faces illuminated by a warm glow that belied the cold reality surrounding them. The power had been shut off. The usual hum of appliances had been replaced by the soft crackle of a single candle's flame, filling the silence that hung between them. They were all huddled around the small dining table, hands clasped together, whispering prayers into the stillness of their modest home. "Lord, we're scared. We're worried." Michelle's voice trembled as she spoke. Her eyes closed tight against the weight of her words. Her hand gripped Marcus's, her lifeline in this storm. "But your word says—" She struggled to finish, her voice breaking under the pressure of weeks of sleepless nights, unpaid bills, and mounting dread. Destiny, their daughter, picked up where her mother left off, her voice steady despite the fear she'd been hiding. "Be anxious for nothing," she whispered, her eyes glancing at her father for reassurance, but finding only his quiet resolve. Anthony, who had been fidgeting anxiously, suddenly joined in, his young voice soft but sure, as if clinging to the only thing that still made sense to him in this chaos. "But in everything by prayer and supplication." His words were a plea, a desperate child's prayer to a God who, so far, had seemed distant. Marcus's deep voice cut through the room, filled with the kind of conviction that comes from a man who has had to believe in the impossible before. "With thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." They sat in silence for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a fragile hope, a desperate cry for some sign, any sign, that they weren't alone in this, that their faith, despite everything, would not fail them. And then, a knock shattered the stillness. It was soft at first, tentative, like the person on the other side wasn't sure whether to intrude on their moment of vulnerability. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the small house. Michelle's heart leapt into her throat, and she exchanged a startled glance with Marcus. It was late, far too late for visitors. Her mind raced. Who could be at the door? What now? Marcus stood up slowly, the wooden chair scraping against the floor as he rose. He moved toward the door with caution, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every step felt heavy, as if the distance to the front door had suddenly stretched, like the universe was holding its breath. He reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle for a brief second before he pulled it open. Standing on the other side was something Marcus hadn't expected: his entire church community. There, on his small porch, stood Pastor Williams at the front, flanked by familiar faces from their congregation. They all wore expressions of warmth and determination, as if they had come with a purpose. Behind them, people held bags full of groceries, their arms overflowing with fresh produce, canned goods, and essentials. The kind of food that Michelle hadn't been able to afford in weeks. Someone else clutched an envelope, bills, he realized, paid in full. And others, with quiet smiles, held out job leads, offers for work that could lift them out of this darkness. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak. The shock of it all washed over him like a wave, and his throat tightened. He blinked, trying to absorb the sight before him. "We've got you," Pastor Williams said softly, stepping forward, his eyes filled with compassion. "The body of Christ takes care of its own." Michelle, who had been holding her breath at the table, stood up slowly and moved to the doorway, her hand covering her mouth as she tried to hold back the sobs that were now rising uncontrollably in her chest. She hadn't cried like this in front of her children, but now, it was all too much. The relief, the gratitude, the sheer overwhelming kindness that had appeared at their doorstep just when they had thought they couldn't go on. Destiny followed, her eyes wide with disbelief, and Anthony peeked out from behind her, his usual restlessness stilled by the miracle unfolding before them. The living room that had felt so empty moments ago was suddenly filled with people, with warmth, with hope. Bags of groceries were laid gently on the kitchen counters, the faint smell of fresh bread and fruit filling the air. The envelope with the paid bills was set on the coffee table, as if to show them that the mountain they had been trying to climb was not insurmountable after all. Job offers were discussed with quiet excitement, possibilities that just that morning had seemed like distant dreams. Pastor Williams turned to Michelle, who by now was shaking with tears of joy. "We're here for you, sister," he said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Michelle, overcome with emotion, once again let the tears fall, her sobs loud and raw as she collapsed into Marcus's arms. For the first time in months, they felt lighter, as if the crushing weight that had been bearing down on them had finally been lifted. It wasn't just the groceries or the bills or the job leads, though those were blessings beyond measure. It was the love, the sheer presence of their community, showing them that they weren't forgotten. As the room filled with conversation, laughter, and the bustle of people preparing food, Marcus stood back, his arm around Michelle, and watched. He took in the sight of his family, no longer alone in their struggle. In that moment, the knock at the door had become something far more. It was the answer to every whispered prayer, every tear shed in the darkness. The peace they had longed for had finally arrived, in the form of their church family standing together, bringing light into their home where only shadows had been. His heart swelled with gratitude, and a single thought echoed in his mind. Faith hadn't just sustained them, it had transformed them. A year later, the Johnson family was still in their modest home, but things had changed. The bills were paid, Marcus had started a successful tutoring program, Michelle had been promoted at the hospital, Destiny had earned a scholarship, and Anthony's grades were back up. The struggles hadn't disappeared, but the peace they had found went beyond understanding. Michelle stood by the kitchen window, watching her family laugh and play in the backyard. "The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding," she thought to herself. "I finally get it." It was never about having everything figured out. It was about trusting, even when we couldn't see the way forward. And a single thought again crossed her mind. Faith hadn't just sustained them, it had transformed them. The Johnson family's journey is one that resonates deeply because it reflects the experience of so many who wonder if their prayers will ever be answered. Inspired by the words of Philippians 4:6, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." And scriptures like Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." This story reminds us that faith does not mean we are exempt from hardship, but that we are never alone within it. As the Johnsons navigate their darkest days, they discover a truth that is both humbling and uplifting. God's presence is often felt most powerfully through the people around us. This story is not just about resilience or faith. It's about the quiet, transformative power of grace that often arrives in ways we least expect. May the Johnsons' journey inspire you, as it did me, to find hope even when the path forward seems unclear, and to trust that, even in our hardest moments, God's love never falters. How do you find strength and maintain faith during times when it feels like life's challenges are overwhelming you? Please comment below. Thank you for stopping by. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. It would be greatly appreciated. And stay tuned for more amazing stories.